Welcome to Ross Night, hosted by the Asia Pacific Youth Association. This program is also co-hosted by Charty Video and the Formosa Correspondence Club, and with support from the Shun Learn group. Our very special guest today is Dr. Robert Eldridge, expert on Japan politics and resident of Japan. We'll just get right into it and talk. But before we talk about the election, Robert, tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be living in Japan.
Thank you very much for hosting me. So I've been in Japan for 31 years. I imagine many of the youth in your organization have not reached the ripe old age of 31 yet. So what that means is that when I was an undergraduate student, I became intensely interested in international affairs. I attended a small liberal arts college in the United States, and I was very lucky to have a lot of international students around me. And I became very good friends with students from around the world, in particular, students from Japan. And that piqued my interest in studying abroad. I didn't go to Japan initially. I went to France based on my previous foreign language experience. And, I was in France in 1989 and traveled throughout Western Europe and Eastern Europe because it was divided at the time. And I got to see the democratic revolutions in Eastern Europe in person, live, as I was traveling around. So it was a very interesting experience. I wanted to go into diplomacy in the future after graduating. And I realized that a North American and European background alone would not be enough for the 21st century. So I wanted to see another part of the world. And at the time, and still today, the Japanese government sponsors a foreign language teaching program called the JET program, the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. I learned about that when I was in France, and I applied for it after returning to Washington, D.C., where I was doing an internship, and I was accepted during my senior year, and left for Japan a couple of months after graduating from college. And my intent was to be here 1 year. 1 year became 2 years, and then 2 years became 31 years. During that time, I went on to graduate school, and I got my master's and then my PhD in the area that I live in today, Kobe University. And I specialized in US-Japan relations and Japanese politics, Japanese political and diplomatic history. I also experienced the 1995 Kobe earthquake, and that got me interested in crisis management and disaster response. And so in addition to my Japanese politics folder, I also specialize in disaster management, crisis management. And while living and working in Japan, I had the opportunity to interact a lot with the US military that's here. And I ended up taking a sabbatical from the university to become the political advisor to the United States Marine Corps in Hawaii. And then that led me to taking a full-time position with the Marine Corps in Okinawa Prefecture. And today I'm back to research full-time. So that's 31 years in a nutshell right there.
You said you're back to research full-time. What are some of your recent publications?
I don't know if you can see it behind me, but last year I was able to publish about 16 books. So I can't go through all of them right now, but generally they focus on US-Japan relations, usually diplomatic history. For example, Okinawa related issues or Senkaku island related issues. One of my more recent books also had to do with completely different subject on university reform. I'm passionate about really empowering the universities and to make them become global leaders in their field. And I don't think the universities today in Japan are really pulling their weight and doing all that they could. So based on my experience, both in public policy as well as education and research, I published a book on that subject. I have a couple of books coming out this month, one on education related issues, and another one on US-Japan relations and the Asia-Pacific region. Published several books on disaster response. So I'm always writing, and it just, each month there's a different topic that's my main focus.
So throughout these 30 plus years now and all your writing, looking back, what was the first, or when was the first Japan House of Representatives election that you were actually in Japan to personally observe?
The first one to observe for me, as far as the lower house, the House of Representatives election, was 1993, and that was a huge election because the then ruling party, which is today's ruling party, called the Liberal Democratic Party, they had begun to implode about 4 years before that. And the result of that implosion was seen in the 1993 July election. The first election I became involved in was in October 1996, so 25 years ago right now. And when I say involved, I mean essentially as an intern with a gentleman who was running in the lower house election. He lost, but to be able to analyze the reason for his loss was academically much more interesting than had he won. And so it was disappointing for him and disappointing for the folks in his office and his family, with whom I'm still very close with. But from an academic point of view, it was very, very interesting. The other election that I would have witnessed early on in Japan would have been the 1992 upper house election. And as most of your viewers would know, Japan has a two-house system, the upper house and the lower house. The lower house tends to have the more power and influence, and the upper house, far less so.
One thing I've observed in elections, whether here in Taiwan or other places around the world, including the United States, somebody always says at each election that this is the most important one. This one's going to decide the future. What about this election in Japan, the recent election? What kind of level of interest was there from outside Japan, for example? And were there people saying this is the most important election in your lifetime in Japan?
I truly believed and that it should be the most important election for Japan right now. The reason I say that is that, and I'm not sure all of your viewers would go along with this, but and we may be jumping ahead in topics, but I believe the tension between in East Asia and the intentions of mainland China vis-a-vis Taiwan are very serious, and I think there could be kinetic activity, in other words, attacks or an invasion, much earlier than many people believe. And I'm looking at a 4-year timetable. And the lower house election chooses candidates or chooses representatives whose term is 4 years. So the lawmakers who are being chosen at this time are going to serve, unless the House is dissolved, for 4 years. And that overlaps with my concern, the timetable about potential Chinese attack or invasion of Taiwan. And this directly impacts Japanese security. So in numerous articles and in lectures I would point out this connection and call on Japanese voters to choose candidates who are interested and concerned about the future of a democratic Taiwan, knowing that Taiwan's security is inherently and intimately connected to Japanese security. And if a candidate expressed no interest or understanding of Taiwan's security, to me, that meant that they didn't understand security in general, and that they didn't understand that Taiwan's security was directly connected to Japanese security. And therefore, to me, they weren't qualified to be candidates. So I truly believe that this was a very important election to choose the candidates who would understand the regional dynamics, at least for the next 4 years. I don't think Japanese voters necessarily voted in that way. So my hopes or my predictions were not, carried through or followed through on. As far as international attention goes, I think it got moderate attention, but the results were essentially known from the beginning. They knew, as did Japanese experts or political experts here within Japan, that the ruling party would lose seats, but they wouldn't lose enough seats to have to step down from government. And it's kind of funny or sad that a ruling party could lose seats but still be in power. So it shows that there's a disconnect, with the electorate, but the electorate doesn't really have too many options to go with.
That's a really interesting point about losing seats. Help us understand a bit why the election occurred at the time it did, that this term was able to go pretty much to its end, its full 4 years. Why was the election now? Or, for example, why wasn't it called earlier by the preceding prime ministers?
Mm-hmm. So putting it in the plural is correct. So within the past 4 years have been 2 additional prime ministers, most recently Suga Yoshihide, and prior to that, Abe Shinzo. So at any point, they have the power to call elections, dissolve the House and call elections. Most likely, the COVID, the corona pandemic, had a big impact on the timing of the election. And I think they waited, in particular Suga, who served the last 1 year, probably waited to see how the pandemic played out and hopefully died out, so that the economy would come back online and people would be able to resume their pre-COVID life and lifestyles and activities. When that did not appear apparent, they had to focus primarily on the COVID response. They may have feared that they would be called irresponsible for doing a political move during a pandemic response. they and then once earlier this spring they started introducing the vaccines. They probably wanted to see what sort of positive effect they would have, and I was surprised that they moved the elections up a little bit early, and they didn't wait until the very, very end, which would have been about November 20th or so, that they could have, had the elections, and they instead did it about 3 weeks early. I thought they would wait and see, get the maximum extent of the timetable so that they could allow the vaccines to truly have their effect. But so they did call it a little bit early. Suga stepped down in September. He was given notice within the party in August, and perhaps carrying into early September, that he would have difficulty winning re-election as the party president, and that in part because party members felt that they couldn't win in the upcoming lower house election if he was heading the party. And so they wanted a new face and new policies to represent the party going into the elections. So Suga was, it was basically a quiet coup within the ruling party, and he decided to step down. I personally am not a huge fan of the current cabinet. I wish it well, but it's not a crisis management cabinet. It's a kind of a business as usual cabinet. Many of the cabinet members are new, they're first-time cabinet members. And if it's a real crisis management cabinet, you don't put inexperienced people in.
Did Suga wait too long, or did this come as a surprise to him? You mentioned that in August, people within the party told him that he wasn't really popular as the LDP leader. There was concern about him leading the election. I mean, should he have known that and resigned earlier, or this came as a surprise to him?
Well, he was sort of a fill-in prime minister in a sense, because Prime Minister Abe stepped down earlier than expected last year, and Suga was kind of asked to fill in. There's different interpretations about whether he stayed on too long, whether he didn't stay on long enough. As far as Prime Minister Abe goes, there's also an argument that he stayed on way too long. He was the longest serving prime minister in Japan. But for the second half of his administration, the past 4 years, there wasn't too much that he really accomplished. He got most of his work done in the first half of his administration. So the view, I think, of many voters is that there isn't another party to turn to, and then within the LDP there aren't really any other candidates to turn to. So they basically accepted Abe staying in power that long, and they trusted his decision to turn power over to Suga on the understanding that Suga would continue Abe's policies. And gradually, Suga began to veer away from Abe's policies. So the more he did that, the less support that he got within the party, let alone what public opinion thought. So he wasn't prime minister material. He was a great chief cabinet secretary. But as far as truly leading the nation, he was basically, a fill-in sort of administrator, basically. So I didn't, prefer to see him in office in the first place. But he he managed, but he didn't truly lead.
And help us understand the LDP leadership election that occurred a few weeks before the House of Representative election. Now, here in Taiwan, we had a bit more visibility to the losing candidates just because of their past involvement with Taiwan or interactions more recently with Taiwan. But why did Fumio Kishida win the leadership election within the party?
Yeah. He was, I believe, viewed as a safe candidate. He had served as foreign minister for approximately 5 years, the longest serving foreign minister. He had a steady hand. He was careful. He listens to people. He's not going to do anything crazy or sudden. So he's a comfortable candidate to have gone with. There were 3 other candidates in the end who stayed until the end. Initially, there were about 8 candidates that narrowed down to about 4. There were 2 females that were running and 2 men. The other man who was the second most popular in number of votes acquired was a gentleman named Kono Taro, and he served in a number of cabinet positions over the years, including foreign minister and defense minister. Most recently, he was in charge of administrative reform as well as the vaccines, and he's known as a reformer, and he likes to challenge certain thinking within the party. So that generated a lot of popularity within the party as well as among public opinion. So the media really looked at him as the leading candidate. But in the final days and week or so, some very negative information about him became public. And it has to do with his financial ties with China. A family-run company that was established in 1995, had very close connections with Chinese manufacturers. And so he was profiting quite a bit from the family business and its connections with China. And there are 2 major problems with that. One, when a politician benefits from financial transactions, based on potentially insider information, that's ethically wrong. And then the second problem was when the financial benefits derive from a country that is openly threatening and challenging the country. There's a national security risk. So many people who watched this closely became absolutely disgusted with Kono. There are 2 other candidates, the female candidates I mentioned. One is Takaichi Sanae, and I believe one of the members of your organization has been to her home prefecture before, which is Nara Prefecture, and Nara is one of the oldest places in Japan. And so she's quite conservative in her views about Japanese tradition, both religious, history, cultural, and a lot of her supporters are of the conservative, bent or nature, and she inspired a lot of people because she talked about a pride that doesn't get talked about too much in Japan. And she won a lot of support both within the party and outside, but she didn't have enough to be elected. And there were some dynamics related to that prevented her from getting elected this time. But most people are looking at her as the candidate of the future. And then there was a 4th candidate who was close with a gentleman named Mr. Nikai, who used to be the Secretary General of the LDP. And Mr. Nikai is considered China's broker here in Japan. So he does a lot of the business on behalf of China. And this individual, Noda Seiko, being close with Nikai, was viewed as close to China. So there was concern about her allegiance to Japan. Let's put it that way.
Let's talk a bit about the voters. Here in Taiwan, for example, we have multiple news channels with talk shows every night, kind of similar to the United States. So the information and the ease with which people could follow politics here in Taiwan is quite obvious and readily apparent. Now, what about in Japan? How closely do voters, do the public follow the daily back and forth of politics up into and including the election?
If they only follow the mainstream media, they're going to not fully understand the political dynamics that are going on. And I think that's true also in the United States. So more and more Japanese over the past 10, 15 years are viewing alternative media or internet sites for their information. Thanks to that, I believe they're much more informed than they were in the past. But depending on where they get their news source, just like in the United States, it tends to form how they view the political situation. So in general, I think they're increasingly informed, but in some cases they may be a little bit more divided than in the past. The media, for example, the newspaper readership tends to be down, and more people, rely on the internet, for their information in that regard. I think, as well, people's economic situations are also driving how they're looking at the political situation. In the past, it was easier to leave it up to the ruling party, namely the Liberal Democratic Party, to rule on everyone's behalf and to basically entrust the government with managing a sound economy. But in the past 30 years, there's been less and less trust in the government to be able to do that. So, because of that, I think they also watch the political situation a little bit more carefully.
What about younger voters? A few years ago, the voting age was lowered to 18. What's the level of participation or interest voting among the younger 18, 20 to 30?
Right. So the millennials in Japan are not as politically active as, for example, millennials in the United States and probably in Taiwan. When the voter age was lowered to 18, about, I believe it was 5 years ago now, the media interest was high, the voter interest became very high, the education outreach to get these, these 18-year-olds, into the voting booths was very high. But what we saw later is that the next election that came up where they had a chance to vote, unfortunately, the voting turnout, their age group was lower, and it became quite similar to older age groups where, it was relatively low. So I don't see young people today being highly involved or active or interested in politics, unfortunately. It doesn't mean they're ignorant of what's going on. I think they tend to follow things, somewhat closely, but that doesn't necessarily mean or translate into political action. Last week, I was in the opposite part of the country, up in Hokkaido, and I had the chance to speak to an undergraduate class. I found that class very interested in international affairs, maybe not as much in domestic politics, but certainly in international affairs. And I think young people are interested in whatever their field is, but politics hasn't really gotten their attention too much.
You mentioned earlier the factor that the role of the economy, of COVID played in the timing of the election, but help us understand a bit what were the voters actually thinking about, or the people who bothered to vote and picked one of the parties on the ballot or the candidates. What are some of the key issues for voters in this election?
Obviously, the key one was, the COVID policies and getting the economy restarted. The concern about the different restrictions that are in place, as far as like traveling and gathering, has been a concern, but not, I wouldn't say as big a concern as in the United States, for example. I would think COVID, or I do believe that COVID was probably the thing that was driving everyone's interest this time more than most. And then on the international affairs front, the concern about China is by far the biggest issue that concerns Japanese in the foreign policy area, and whether the Japanese government is doing enough to preserve its territorial integrity and to prevent Chinese bullying in the region.
Is there any variation in voter concern among the different islands or Okinawa? Do people in Hokkaido, for example, have a different set of concerns than people in Kyushu or vice versa?
Yeah, certain areas, even though, like, for example, Hokkaido tends to be a little bit more on the leftist side. And that's in part because of this strong labor unions that exist up there. In Okinawa, there's a very vocal leftist group, and currently they control the gubernatorial seat, the governor's seat in Okinawa. But most of the municipalities in Okinawa Prefecture are actually either conservative or who have voted conservative in this election. What the media portrays Okinawa, for example, to be as this leftist bastion is not necessarily what's true on the ground. Because Okinawa Prefecture is essentially on the front line of Japan's security in the region, Okinawan voters tend to be much more realistic about what the situation really is. And public opinion polls tend to show Okinawans to have even stronger concern about, for example, China. In the southernmost part of Okinawa Prefecture, there's an island called Yonaguni. And from Yonaguni, you can actually see northern Taiwan. That's how close, the two countries are. And so, many Okinawans understand that the seriousness of the situation. Voters become more lackadaisical as you get closer to the capital and essentially more secure. So those that are on the outer islands, the front-lying areas, tend to be the most, realistic about the situation.
Here in Taiwan, we have some referendums in December two of which are related to energy policy. I'm somewhat surprised, when you discuss what the voters might be interested in, those kind of day-to-day issues, whether it's energy, taxes, education policy, don't seem to be a factor.
Generally, Japanese are they are concerned about prices. They are concerned about, different policies that drive, planning for the future. So they're not interested in it. But a lot of it has to do with how much they've read up on these issues. And so the ruling party produced a very thick pamphlet about what its policies are. But whether Japanese voters, read through all of that and make their decisions on that, I'm not really sure. They tend to vote, based on, who they're comfortable with as a party, who they like, maybe as an individual. They have a small constituency district system in place here in Japan, and so they only choose essentially one candidate for their district. In the past, it was a multi-candidate seat, and so they had a little bit more luxury in who they were voting for. Now they're basically choosing one candidate, and they choose one party in the proportional representation, and they can choose a different party if they wanted to, about who they're comfortable with than necessarily all the details about the party.
Let's talk a bit more about the parties. Before we talk about the LDP, let's talk about some of the other parties that are in the House of Representatives. Tell us about the main opposition party, what's now called the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan. What do they stand for?
Yeah, there are essentially two democratic parties. They broke up a few years ago, and they are generally center-left parties. They may be, challenging of the economic policies. They may be challenging of the trade policies. They may be challenging of the security arrangements that Japan has with the United States. They often talk about having a more equal relationship with the United States, or a relationship where there's greater autonomy. They tend to be against constitutional reform that would allow Japan to possibly play a larger role in the region or internationally. There may be candidates within the party that don't necessarily go along with what the party wants. They may be a little bit more conservative on some issues, or a little bit more leftist or progressive on other issues. These opposition parties, for example, the Democratic parties, are relatively new parties. They've been around, generally about 30 years in different forms. So they don't really practice strong party discipline. And occasionally different party members are torn off from these democratic parties to join, for example, the ruling party, if their views are conservative enough, or if they've clashed enough with their own party leaderships. They tried this time to form a united front in the elections, and there was a lot of hype and a lot of attention on the ability to cooperate in this election. And when I say cooperate, what essentially that means is that if rather than running candidates from each of their parties in the same district, they would coordinate which candidate to run. And if one party had a candidate that they wanted to run in district, they would call on the other opposition parties to support him or her in that district, and in exchange, they would give their support in another location. In the end, it didn't work out for them. But there was another opposition party that stood alone that did make a lot of gains this time around. And they were the most disruptive of the opposition parties toward the ruling party. And they're called the Japan Innovation Party. In Japanese, it's called Ishin no Kai. And they're a local party that has grown nationally. And they started off in Osaka, in the area that I live in. And they basically won almost all of the seats for Osaka City, or Osaka Prefecture, 11 of the 15. And they were able to essentially eliminate some of the really important people in the ruling party, and either took them out in their constituencies, or in some cases, beat them so badly that they weren't able to get proportional seats later. And so there's a view that they may, continue to grow and rise in the future. It's hard to expect them to cooperate with the other opposition parties because they're ideologically different. Ishin no Kai is a very conservative party, or said to be a very conservative party, whereas the other ones are center left. And the center left parties cooperated with the Communist Party this time. And that caused a lot of criticism in Japan, to work with the Communist Party.
What makes a Communist Party in Japan attractive to some voters? They seem to always win a small number of seats in every election. What's the allure?
Not being a Japanese voter and not being a Communist Party supporter, it'd be hard for me to describe it. But the Communist Party's been around for approximately 100 years in Japan, although it did experience suppression during different periods in its existence. It tends to be a serious and hardworking party, and many people, I think, acknowledge that, and they see them to be, serious about the issues and working hard. To give an example, many years ago, I observed one of the sessions of the lower house. And while many in the ruling party were talking, sleeping, not paying attention, the leader of the Communist Party was seated upright, carefully making notes, listening to the discussion. And I think many voters, look at the Communist Party as being, a serious party. With the labor unions, they've been able to, maintain a certain, support base. They run in constituencies where they're almost certain to win. So they have a certain amount of electoral security or safety. And so they're almost guaranteed to have certain people elected or reelected. The electoral cooperation this time, I think, worked pretty well for the Communist Party. I believe they only lost one seat. In these COVID times, you would think they may have done better, but I think those are probably some of the reasons why Japanese voters would still, support them. And I've also heard talk of people who have absolutely no connection with the Communist Party being interested in supporting them this time around. And I don't know if it was in jest or if it was serious, but several people I do know weren't really jesting about it. They were kind of serious about it.
And there's another party that seems to always win some seats that works in coalition, usually with the LDP. That's the Komei Party. Tell us a bit about them, what they stand for.
Yeah, so the Komei Party has been around for approximately 60 years. They are a party that is nominally independent of their main support group, which is a religious organization called Soka Gakkai. The party was formed about 60 years ago, essentially as the political arm of this religious group. But that connection increasingly got criticism, and so they're nominally independent of the political or the religious party, although in overwhelming majority, probably anywhere from 90-95% of the votes that they get are from this Soka Gakkai organization. They've been in a coalition with the ruling LDP since approximately 1998, 1999. They were out of power for 3 years, but essentially for 20 years, they've been working hand in hand as the junior coalition partner of the LDP. They tend to be a center-left party, and they've historically had very close ties with the People's Republic of China. And this is even before Japan and China normalized relations. Because of their close ties with China and their center-left policies, essentially pacifist policies, they act as a brake on the ruling party on security matters and foreign policy matters, to the extent that that the LDP has taken into consideration the views of Komei Party, when it discusses revising the constitution or adopting new legal legislation for security matters, or when they're dealing with China. They don't have a lot of seats, under 30 or so, but they can make or break certain candidates. So, for example, if they withhold their support from an LDP candidate in a constituency, that person may lose their seat. So they can force LDP candidates to essentially go along with them. So they're a small party, but they exercise a lot of influence over the ruling party. And many of the Japanese conservatives who support the LDP are very unhappy with this situation.
Well, let's spend some more time on the China issues. Were there any statements or policy ideas by LDP candidates that really struck you as that's a candidate with a great idea? I'm referring to things like investments in new weapon systems, potentially new forward deployments. You mentioned Yonaguni Island, working with other partners. Give us some examples where a candidate said something during the campaign that you thought was that's a security idea that the new government needs to seriously consider.
Yeah, I wasn't able to observe every single candidate in every constituency, but they generally would follow the party line based on the pamphlet that I described a few moments ago. Within that, my view is that some of their stances were a little bit weak. The LDP stances were a little bit weak. So, for example, they talked about Taiwan joining the current iteration of the TPP, and they said they welcome Taiwan's joining it, and I welcome that statement. However, I would phrase it differently. Not only do they welcome Taiwan's admission, I would have liked to see that they would proactively facilitate or they would proactively encourage or sponsor something like that, something much more positive than simply welcoming. There is a debate now among the LDP as a whole about doubling Japan's defense budget, and that's long necessary, long due, and we'll see, how those discussions move along. Basically, as you know, Japan's kept its defense budget at roughly 1% of its GDP since 1976. So for 45 years, it's been pegged at 1% the whole time. And that's far below most other, countries and allies, and certainly below what the major challenge and threat in the region is. So those kind of policies are things that I'm happy to see. I thought the Kishida administration's response to the October 4th incursion by more than 50 PLA aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone was extremely weak. There were three things that I wanted Japan and the United States to do at that time. The first one was that I thought Kishida should have called out China specifically and criticized it. They didn't do that. They basically said, we hope that that the two parties deal with this, peacefully, and that Japan would continue to monitor the situation. And then the chief cabinet secretary, his name is Matsuno, he emphasized that this is longstanding Japanese policy. But I was wondering about that because it was an unprecedented incursion into Taiwan's airspace. And why should Japan simply follow that up with its longstanding policy? I think Japan should have really upped the stakes in that. The second thing I think Japan and the United States should have discussed and should have done was I would have liked to have seen U.S. Fighter planes and reconnaissance aircraft be relocated to Taiwan from Japan. And third, I would have liked to have seen Japan and the United States invite Taiwanese military forces to participate in the multilateral training that was going on in the South China Sea at the time. And all three of those would have been a clear, direct response to what China had done. Obviously, China would have gone ballistic about that, but the two countries should have been willing to tell China that every time it provokes Taiwan or that it does something dangerous to the peace and stability of the region, the US and Japan will respond in kind. So that Kishida didn't do that, I was a little bit disappointed.
Do you have expectations for other actions outside of the defense and security space with regard to China from the new government? Things like sanctions that we see the United States and Western countries imposing on government officials, banning products from certain parts of China, most notably Xinjiang. There's talk of boycott, at least a diplomatic boycott of the upcoming Olympics. What are your expectations for other actions with regard to China from the new government?
In all honesty, unfortunately, I don't think the government's going to do too much. But there are strong expectations among Japanese, opinion leaders and public opinion that the Japanese government should be doing exactly, what you mentioned. So we'll see how it plays out. But there's strong interest in Japan in that. And starting earlier this year, in March this year, there have been more than 30 municipalities that have passed resolutions criticizing China's human rights violations, and calling on the central government to do something about it. And so I think we'll see more and more pressure like that on the government to do something like that. And historically in Japanese foreign policy, it's unusual for the Japanese government to do something on its own. It tends to wait to see how public opinion pressures it. And so there could be an expectation on the Japanese government side that they want to see more of that public pressure, and then they could use that public pressure as a reason for taking action.
Very quickly, in Okinawa, there was a lot of discussion I saw in English language media reports that this might be the election where the LDP does better than the past, and that specifically was because of voter concerns about security and China issues. How did that turn out eventually?
Yeah, so the LDP did do better than in recent years in this election. They won, let's see, there are 4 constituencies. They won, I believe, 2 seats, and they lost 2 seats. And then I think 1 or 2 they gained as well in proportional representation. So I think they won 3, probably 3 overall. And they, the anti-base forces also retired one of their most, prominent members. And so that, I think that's also significant, that one of their leading voices over the past several decades is no longer, in a position of influence anymore. Whether this represents a long-term trend or not is uncertain, though. Whether it was a one-off or the start of something new. Next year, there's several important elections. The first one's going to be in January, and that's for the Nago City mayor. And Nago City is the location where one of the bases is being relocated to. There's some tension within the ruling party there. And so if they end up fighting among themselves, then the anti-base candidate might get chosen. There's going to be an upper house election in the summer, and then the gubernatorial election in the early fall. So it'd be hard to say where things stand now without going through those next 3 elections. But the ruling party did do well in this election, but whether to really make it stick or not will require several more elections.
And on Taiwan, you mentioned some of your hopes, or frankly, some of your disappointments in how the government responded to the Chinese air incursions into the Taiwan ADIZ recently. Are there any members of the new House of Representatives or people who are going to be serving in the government that we here in Taiwan should be paying attention to?
There are several, individuals that probably everyone already knows about. The current defense minister, Mr. Kishi Nobuo, who's former Prime Minister Abe's younger brother. He has been retained as the defense minister, and I believe tomorrow being Monday the 8th, as far as the today's recording goes, the Kishida new cabinet should be getting started, I believe. So most likely Kishi will be continued on as defense minister. he is one of the most well-known pro-Taiwan lawmakers in Japan. There's an upper house member named Sato Masahisa, and he's distinguishable because he has the mustache, and he formerly served in the Japanese army called the Ground Self-Defense Forces. He's been working extra hard in dialogues with Taiwan on security matters. As you know, currently Japan doesn't have a Taiwan Relations Act like the United States does with Taiwan. And there's been discussion for the past 16 years, at least, for Japan to create a Taiwan Relations Act or a Taiwan Friendship Act. The names vary, but the idea would be to have some sort of legislation binding the two countries together more. So Mr. Sato's been a big supporter of that. He calls for a 2+2 dialogue on Taiwan's security with Japan, and so he's been promoting that and helping with that. Unfortunately, there was one major impact of the election on Taiwan in a negative manner, and that was a lower house member named Nakayama Yasuhide unfortunately lost his bid for re-election in the Osaka constituency number 4, and he was beaten by this upstart local party. Why this is important for Taiwan is that he is by far the leading voice of Taiwan in the Japanese parliament. If you remember earlier this year, he made a statement to the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., to the effect that Taiwan is not just Japan's friend, it's its brother. And he truly believes that from the bottom of his heart. And so his losing his seat in the House of Representatives is very serious. And so hopefully others will, take his place and promote Taiwanese-Japan relations. And I hope that, Taiwanese, viewers of your show and also others, those in Japan, maybe those in the United States, will, help to continue that, building that relationship between Japan and Taiwan and the United States in political, economic, security, matters.
One final question before we go. I'm going to ask you to look into the future. The next time there's a Japan lower house election, what are the China-related issues we'll be talking about when we meet again to talk about the next election?
Yeah, if it goes the full 4 years, and if my concern that I explained in the very beginning come to reality, in other words, Taiwan's been attacked and invaded and taken over, then we're talking about a completely different world. It's the beginning of the end of the world at that point, I think. Japan would have become isolated by that point. Japan would be cut off basically from the rest of the world. Its sea lanes disrupted. A salami effect on Japan's territory would have already taken place. So we're talking about a smaller Japan at that point. Its economy, essentially brought to a standstill by any maritime blockade that China wanted to place on Japan. So to me, that's why these 4 years were so important, and why members of the House of Representatives needed to be very savvy on defense matters, because if you're going to stand up to a bully, you got to do it quickly before the bully becomes too big.
Well, Dr. Eldridge, thank you so much for joining our show today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Ross Night, hosted by the Asia Pacific Youth Association. Good night.